Hey there YouTube, I'm Yukitsu, this is Yukitsu Times. Welcome to my channel, welcome to a little bit of Battlefleet Gothic. So we're continuing along telling you sort of reasons why you might be losing against factions, and we're on to Chaos at this point in time. So we're going to be talking a little bit about their basic ships and the sort of general premise of their entire fleet and some standouts in it. Now, Chaos is a long-range carrier and lance-based fleet. They're fairly good at those particular roles. You could argue that Tau are now the better carrier faction, but it's difficult to say for sure which of them is better at that particular fleet type. Now, what makes them so deadly in that sort of carrier fight is the speed of their ships. They've got a 225 speed on their basic carrier here, allowing it to keep away from enemy ships very effectively. There's little you can do if you've got a short-ranged slow ship that is getting attacked by these carriers, because they're simply going to be able to launch bombers at you ad nauseum without you being able to counter it or react, which is basically the only way these carriers can typically win a fight. They're simply going to deploy their bombers and move away from you as fast as is possible. The Mark II, similarly, has extremely long range on their lance batteries, allowing them to stay at range and use their broadside, chipping away at your ship and its shields and its hull from very, very long range until it's actually managed to erode that down and deal significant damage to you, and then it can run away with its high speed at a later point if you get a little bit closer. Once you get into the cruiser tier, you can see some ships that have similarly got that high speed of 225. Other ships in this class do not have that 225 speed, 188 there, all the way down to here. So you could be seeing slightly slower ships, but 188 is still enough to get away from a lot of ships in this game. So unless you're playing with something like light cruisers or you're playing Eldar, it's pretty likely that you'll have ships that can get away, or that are going to have a difficult time catching up to a Chaos cruiser. It's not until you get to the battleships that you start to see ships that are going to have a really hard time getting away from enemy ships here at a speed of 150. Once you're starting to use the despoiler class ship or what have you, or the other option, which is the Desolator, which is a little bit faster but is short range if I recall correctly. I never like using the Desolator because it's kind of a weird ship. Actually, this is extremely long range, but yeah, it's not a ship that I particularly like. But once you get to this tier, you're probably going to be one to slug it out with the enemy ships regardless, just because your weapon batteries and other abilities are so powerful that you can actually just deal tons and tons of damage anyway without having to worry about kiting away and stuff like that, unless you're up against something really scary like a battle barge. So basically, Chaos is capable of just constantly dumping out fighters and running away, or firing lance fire and then running away. That is sort of one of the things about them. And there isn't great counters to this depending on the skill of your opponent, unfortunately, which is one of the things that makes Chaos one of the most frustrating fleets to fight against. Now, this means that you can simply hide in a gas cloud and deny them vision. This is going to make it much harder for them to actually deploy fighters against you, or you can, of course, run into stealth mode. You have to watch out, of course, for recon beacons and such like that, because it will allow them to see your ships even if you're in stealth or in a gas cloud. You simply move out of the radius of that. Now, if he does get close enough to drop a recon beacon onto a ship that has no longer got shields, that's a different story. In that particular case, it is much more practical for you to have that ship sort of move back behind the rest of your fleet, but also he had to get close enough that you probably could have engaged on his fleet for a short period before he could turn around and get away from there. So those are sort of your options in that particular case. Now, Chaos fleet that is simply running constantly is not particularly fun to play against, and if you're a newer player, it can be extremely frustrating and annoying to play against it. In those particular cases, I recommend simply camping. It's not your fault that you have to do that. It's just one of the cases in the game where your opponent is doing a strategy where they're just constantly running around in circles. There's no point in you getting your fleet strung out and separated to chase down those ships. It's simply not any particularly good reason for it. Now, there are certain fleets that can catch them, but if you're a new player, often it's going to be quite difficult to do that. Now, going through the other ship's characteristics, and explaining why you might be taking a little bit more damage than you otherwise would, we can talk about the heavy macro turrets here. So people don't think of Chaos as having very good macro weapons or good broadside potential or anything of that sort. They think of them as that long-range standoff fleet, and the people who play as Chaos seem to believe themselves to be that as well. But they've actually got a very decent heavy macro turret here, 3 damage per macro turret per second. If we calculate this out, and with 2 of them, that means they've got 6 damage per second. This is actually pretty close to the full damage per second of the broadside on the Dauntless class light cruiser, and it's actually pretty damn close to the full damage of the Dauntless firing straight forward. Now, it is a little bit less in both cases, but if you add on the 3 damage per second from the fighter base on top of it, you're actually capable of dealing more damage per second than the Dauntless if you're able to use these macro cannons. By contrast, the 3 damage per second from the launch base is kind of pathetic in all honesty. It's not going to be dealing too much damage to most opponents there. And it's also probably not going to be that much damage to begin with, because turrets are probably going to destroy some of your bombers. The Mark II is the other alternative, having lance weapons instead of carrier capacity. They've got a total of 2 damage per second per side as well, giving them pretty decent attack power, but again, if you're able to add in that heavy macro turret damage, it's quite a lot better. It goes from 2 damage per second to 8 damage per second in potential. Of course, 2 lance damage is far better at long range than the 6 damage per second from the macro turrets, because you're probably going to see it reduced to like 3 hits and then a 1.5 damage total. But it's pretty comparable. It's pretty similar in many respects in terms of damage. So if you're taking a little bit more damage than you thought you were going to, it could very well be that you're in that macro turret range and you're showing the weak side armor, because it does actually matter whether or not you're showing Chaos ships your strong armor side or not. And I think a lot of players sort of underestimate the use of heavy armor against Chaos ships. Now, even if you're a relatively low level player, you might be ending up against a Slaughter class cruiser. This thing breaks the rules of the typical engagement style of Chaos, because it is a short-range, macro-focused ship. If we were to look at it, it's got the sort of same turret arrangement here in most respects there. 3 damage per second on that type and 3 damage per second on that type, for a total of 6 damage per second from the turrets. And then we can look at the twin-linked batteries. So each of these has 1 damage per second from the lance, so that lance there is 2 damage per second, or 1 damage per second, sorry. And then they've got the macro weapons there. They've got 4 macro weapons firing at 1 damage per second each, for a total of 5 from the entire arrangement there, including the 1 lance. This means that between the 2 of them, you're doing 10 damage, and if you're able to also add in the turrets, you're doing 16. This is actually more damage than the Dominator, which is one of the best broadside ships in the game. The advantage that the Dominator has, of course, is the addition of the Nova Cannon, and the fact that it has the heavier prow armor, but that doesn't necessarily matter if you're going in for a broadside-to-broadside fight. So Slaughter is actually capable of winning a broadside-to-broadside fight against something like a Dominator. Very scary thing to think about. This does mean that if you're up against a cruiser tier ship, the normal strategy of trying to get in close and going broadside against an enemy ship might go poorly if you're up against a Slaughter class cruiser, or many of their other cruiser tier ships are similar things. The Carnage is a similar type of ship. The only advantage of it is it's got slightly longer range. It just does a little bit less damage. The Murder has the same sort of thing going on for it, but it also has that sort of long-range heavy prow lance, which is not particularly good since they give up all their turrets for it, making this one of the weakest ones there. Then there's the Devastation, which is the carrier variety. Still pretty okay broadsides, though. So functionally, like, the only one that's really a standout from their style, though, is the Slaughter, which is just close-range, pure DPS. It's very strong in that sort of class. Then when you get back into the battleships and battlecruisers, you're looking more at sort of normal things. You're looking at carriers, you're looking at long-range lances, capable of dealing some pretty good damage there, and you're looking at sort of weird types of ship arrangements that I personally don't like as much, but whatever. Anyway, next thing to talk about are the favors. Chaos favors are extremely meaningful. Depending on what you're up against, it can change the Chaos player's playstyle and strengths completely. Tzeentch is the stealth one. It's a fairly advanced one. Typically, you're not going to see newer players using it, but basically this means that your opponent is always going to be in a gas cloud, and having a gas cloud is a huge advantage in this game, even if it's only got like a 90% uptime, which this does. You're typically going to find yourself having to get within certain ranges, and that can synergize really well with something like the Slaughter or with Tzeentch, or Slaanesh, I mean. So if you're finding yourself in a situation where you're being forced to get in close to your opponent to engage, that could be something that you have to get sort of used to, but that's a more advanced technique. We'll talk about that a little bit later. You're not likely to find a lot of Tzeentch players early on. Next up is Khorne. Khorne is pretty basic. There isn't much that you need to think about when you're up against Khorne ships, because it's just lightning strikes and boarding actions, which, while they're powerful and the bonuses are good, those are things that they're going to be doing to you anyway, and they're going to be able to deal quite a lot of damage to you anyway. So it's just a factor that you're going to have to consider, that those might be a little bit more damaging than usual, but there's not a whole lot you can do about it. Next up is the the Mark of Nurgle. Mark of Nurgle adds in some good damage constantly to you at sort of close range, and it makes these guys so that they're pretty much impossible to board properly. So if you're up against a ship with the Mark of Nurgle, ultimately what you're going to want to do is keep out of that Mark of Nurgle radius if at all possible. This is often difficult because Chaos ships are quite fast, and therefore they're going to be able to get in amongst your ships very, very quickly. If you, at all possible, try and focus down the Mark of Nurgle ship earlier, especially if you have lots of lighter, weaker ships, like say Tau ships with their 400 hull points, because they're going to be sapping your ships down very, very quickly. If they have an all Nurgle fleet, however, that's going to be impossible, and you're simply going to have to destroy their ships before that damage can track up fast enough to destroy all of yours. Note that the Mark of Nurgle damage auras don't stack, so it doesn't matter if your opponent has brought in 4 or 5 or whatever ships with the Mark of Nurgle. If you keep your ships close together, you'll still be taking the same amount of damage as if you were spread out and each fighting one. So you might as well keep your ships together, focus that fire as much as possible, and try and destroy the ships one by one. Other than that, though, you know, it's a tricky mark to fight against. It's very, very powerful, especially on something powerful at close range like the Slaughter, and that is typically what you're going to see the Mark of Nurgle on and being most effective with. You could also see this on things like carriers, however, or other long-range ships. And this is to make it so that if your ships are trying to get really close to something that wants to stay at long range, you're going to be punished for it, essentially. So if you're fighting, for example, a Styx-class cruiser with the Mark of Nurgle, it doesn't want you to get close by, but if you do get close by and it's got the Mark of Nurgle, you're going to start taking some damage that you might otherwise not want to be taking. So it just is a way for them to sort of punish players for getting into that optimal engagement range, force you to sort of take damage either way. Lastly, you've got the Mark of Slaanesh. Again, this is not something that newer players tend to take. This is something that more advanced players tend to take because it's a little bit fiddly to use, and deciding when to use it is a little bit more tricky. It's also something that I cannot recommend using with autocast. So the Mark of Slaanesh's most important ability here is Slaanesh's Promise. Special orders in this game are extremely powerful and extremely useful. The 20 armor from Brace for Impact can basically reduce damage by nearly half if you're a 50 armor vehicle, or it can reduce it by like what the hell is it? By 80% or something like that, if you're using something that has 75 armor, such as an Imperial ship firing from the front. And that is extremely, extremely powerful. It makes it so that your ship on Brace for Impact is going to be taking significantly less damage, especially if it's being focused on by multiple enemy ships. Being able to suddenly remove this special order for Brace for Impact, in particular, means that that ship that is being focused down is suddenly going to take the full brunt of your firepower, and is probably going to be destroyed as a result of that. So, Slaanesh is one of those ones where if you're flying along and you've braced for impact on a tough, durable ship, and you think that that's going to help you get your ship out of there, get it out of that situation, or deal enough damage to the enemy that maybe they regret trying to focus firing you down, and suddenly your ship just starts taking tons of damage because you're off orders, that could very well be because you're up against Mark of Slaanesh. And it's an extremely difficult thing to counter because it's a long-range ability, and typically you're going to want to fight Chaos at fairly close range. So you're going to suddenly be braced for impact because you're suddenly taking tons and tons of fire from something, and then it just sort of hits you and your ship gets exploded. But anyway, those are the things that I typically find allow Chaos fleets to win in fights. That might not necessarily be that obvious or that clear to players. Obviously, they're also going to be able to just win through sheer kiting power, but that's one of the things that you're going to expect when you're playing against Chaos. That's something that you should probably realize is going to happen. Anyway, let's go ahead and try and get into a match, probably against the AI again, but we'll see you on the battlefield. Alright, so here we are. We're playing against a couple of bots. Now, we're up against the Tau Empire, which is an interesting thing to be up against. We'll see what that actually translates into. But yeah, again, we're playing with 2 carriers here. This is a very typical arrangement for Chaos, especially early game, where the Mark IIs just don't have that much damage per second. They're actually out DPS'd by, of all things, carriers, which is a little bit pathetic, but, you know, such is life sometimes. Either way, let's go ahead and hit ready up here. As per usual, the AI, for some reason, likes splitting up their ships, and I have no idea why that is the case. Let's try and kill this isolated ship first, I think. So, one of the things that we're going to be looking out for in this particular case is simply keeping our distance. And this is because a lot of the time when you're playing against Chaos, that is what they're going to be doing. And if you're playing against Chaos, it's often very, very dangerous to be fighting them, just because they're going to be able to keep away from your ships. They're going to pick away at them with their bombers, and then slip away very, very rapidly. Tau ships have a speed of 150 compared to my 225, so I practically move as fast as them when they're using all the head orders when I'm moving at a normal speed. This of course makes it extremely difficult for him to properly catch my ships out. And because of this, you're going to often find Tau ships just don't have the ability to catch up to Chaos ships if the Chaos ships decide to try and pull a runner, making vision manipulation extremely important in this particular sort of matchup.
Tremble, for chaos
So
comes.
we're going to try and get vision of the ship here as soon as we can. We also see that our Chaos Bomber Squadron has a similar range to this ability, so as soon as we clipped it, we'll be able to sort of send out a bomber wave and probably deal a little bit of damage depending on what the ship is. We've got our bombers on automatic cast. Here you can definitely see that this messenger here is probably screwed.
Eternally.
And here come the bomber waves.
Setting course.
So we've been identified here, but we are able to slip back into the clouds.
We'll follow your command.
Now we just have to wait a little while for our stuff to reload.
Engines hot.
And this is one of the dangers here. There's tremendous burst potential from bombers, and it's not necessarily that easy to sort of understand that when you're in the middle of a heat of a battle where it's like suddenly you take 300 damage and you're like, why did I suddenly take 300 damage? That's huge. Well, it's probably because you got hit by bombers, and that is the most common answer. Eldar bombers deal a little bit more. Each one of them deals 120. Each wave deals 120. By contrast, each wave of mine deals 90. Tau ones also deal a little bit more damage if I recall correctly, but maybe not actually. I think that theirs just deal it in a more discrete burst because they've got like one bomb per bomber wave. A little bit weird, but is how they sort of work. Now,
For the dark gods.
let's go ahead and drop ourselves.
We have sighted an enemy ship.
Another recon beacon here, and you can see again,
Engines hot.
got ourselves a big incoming wave of bombers. I don't know why the hell this thing is so damaged.
Just show us something to kill.
Something clearly happened to it.
Your orders.
But here you can see, like, this is just sort of how playing as Chaos works and playing against Chaos works. They sort of move away from you constantly, picking away at your ships, dealing damage, avoiding line of sight whenever possible.
Command me.
Now, we are going to get line of sighted here, but at this point it doesn't matter anywhere near as much. I'm going to go ahead, in fact, lag out, but
Tremble, for chaos comes.
yeah, might as well fight a little bit here. I'm going to go ahead and switch this to fighter wave, since I would like to get a fighter wave.
For the dark gods.
And we can withstand taking a few hits here. You can see that heavy damage I was talking about from those. It's something that, again, people don't necessarily expect, is that heavy damage from Chaos turrets there. Alright, and you can see that we've managed to block almost all those torpedoes. That's another advantage, again, of these sorts of ships. Alright, that ought to destroy that ship there. And at this point in time, we just need to go ahead and finish off this last ship, their light cruiser.
Your orders.
It's gonna take me a little while longer before I can get a vision thing on it, but
For now.
alright, so what I'm going to do is have this ship stay at station here. We're gonna have this one go around so that it cannot actually track our ships properly. And you can see that it's going to give me the ability to fire into the flank of it with one of my ships here, so that's going to be the important part here.
You're unstoppable.
Once again, here comes that big burst. You can see that I was doing a little bit of damage, but less damage than him. I would have lost eventually in a sort of gun-to-gun fight, but as you can see, this fight is now starting to turn in my favor.
Galaxy burn. Ready eternally.
And you can also see like the consistent damage being put out by these shots to the rear, in particular with those turrets there.
Me.
It's actually dealing quite a lot of damage to him. You can see how much damage that was. That's actually quite good. I'm actually going to get this guy in close enough range to get a...
Our strike team slaughtered them.
Alright, got that cancel warp success there.
We're unstoppable.
You can see that my opponent is trying to use the repair actions here, but ooh, we've lost quite a lot of stuff here. And the bridge, that's not good. But here comes that sudden burst damage from those bombers, and that should actually be enough to fully destroy the rest of this ship here. And you think to yourself, I'm on 300 hit points, I can still fight this, I can probably still go for a little bit longer, and then suddenly your ship just explodes. That's sort of the thing about fighting against carrier-type ships. You're doing fine, and then suddenly you just take 300 damage in a burst, a discrete burst. It's kind of an interesting way to play. It's actually probably more like 200 in the end there. But yeah, that's probably one of the demonstrations of like how to use chaos. Once you get to a certain point, you don't have to keep kiting, honestly. I think players get into that mindset that they have to keep kiting. They could win the battle more decisively and more quickly if they just close into range and start actually fighting under a lot of those situations, especially if they're using, if they're up against only one remaining ship in that particular case. But in any event, that is a look at chaos. One of the other things you'll have to consider, you can get a dramatic reduction in the cooldown for your fighters if you take automated refueling systems. This does make it so that your squadrons are a lot more deadly because you're going to be launching a lot faster. So that's an extremely common thing. If you're taking more damage than you thought you would from the carriers, that's probably because they've got automated refueling systems. The other thing they've probably got are the Warp Talon or equivalent squadron upgrade. Basically, this allows it to get more bombers through your fighter waves, through your turret defenses, and allows them to deal more damage ultimately with those sorts of weapons. So that is our look at Chaos. Pretty interesting faction. I don't particularly like playing against them because of the way that they typically play, but there are counters to them. We'll talk about that maybe in a more advanced video. But if you're losing against your typical sort of Chaos player, those are things to look out for. Anyway, I hope you found this video enjoyable, and of course, as always, I hope to see you guys all next time.